Thank you to the press for being here. I'm going to ask Joe and Rose Anderson to just open us up in a prayer as we start this day and we start new government and our relationship, of course, with all of you. Thank you.
Amigos, kaganati diyan kasi mantu, which is sinama mais ni boka and ingese kinagego mantu. Then I met the one on a wagon swat. Kinagego which is namking as on and thousand, me which.
Well, thank you. I want to recognize our elders and our knowledge keepers, our people that help us pray. Nice to see you all this morning. I want to recognize Joe and Rose Anderson for the prayers this morning and for being available today. I also want to acknowledge that we are on the Anishinaabe Algonquin territory here in Ottawa, beautiful Ottawa, and thank you to all of the media for attending. We are pleased to be here to release the AFN's third report regarding Canada's First Nations infrastructure gap. As you know, the Assembly of First Nations has released a series of reports over the past year with the federal government and the Conference Board of Canada to highlight the First Nations infrastructure gap as a nation-building project. Our first report last April captured the scale of investments required to close the gap by 2030. With the Government of Canada, we concluded that was $350 billion. In our November 2024 report, the Conference Board estimated the economic benefits to Canada of closing the infrastructure gap over 7 years at $635 billion and 330,000 jobs across this beautiful country. And that's for all Canadians, including First Nations. The third report, which we released today, concludes that massive economic benefits are the tipping of the iceberg when it comes to the socioeconomic benefits for First Nations, particularly related to housing, education, and clean water. Sadly, the First Nations infrastructure gap has perpetuated and deep-rooted inequality in our country. This disparity has led to poorer health outcomes, limited education opportunities, and much less prosperity compared with other Canadians. So the benefit of addressing this discriminatory infrastructure gap cannot be overstated. Beyond moral obligations and economic returns, these investments will provide safe and healthy living conditions, improve education outcomes, strengthen mental health, stabilize families, and empower First Nations to be all that we can be. Among other things, the Conference Board report highlights housing as a top priority. Poor housing conditions pose serious health risks to First Nations. According to the 2021 census, First Nations are 4 times more likely to live in crowded housing than other Canadians, and 6 times more likely to live in a home that needs major repairs. Crowded and unsafe housing creates negative outcomes beyond poor physical health. Family violence, substance abuse, barriers to education, and the loss of our culture. So we welcome the Prime Minister Carney's commitment to get Canada back into the business of building houses. But to be successful, they must reflect First Nations perspectives from the start. That includes the new initiatives that were referred to yesterday in the speech from the throne. The Build Canada Homes Initiative, the $25 billion for prefabricated homes, and the $10 billion of low-cost financing for home construction. First Nations need to be at the table as these are developed over the coming weeks. And the benefits related to job training and construction must flow to First Nations people and businesses. In addition to housing, education infrastructure is another key element of this report that we would like to see and that we would like to touch on briefly here today. The late Justice and former Senator Murray Sinclair often said, "Education got us into this mess, and education will get us out." So if we know this in a beautiful, rich country like Canada, why are half of our First Nations schools either overcrowded or in need of major additions or in need of immediate replacement? The conference board makes it clear that the benefits of investing $13 billion to close this education gap go beyond the $22 billion of financial return for the economy. With safe, modern schools fully connected to the internet, as if we're having this talk in 2025, First Nations can leverage our own resources, create self-sustaining economies, and real hope for a more prosperous future. Thinking ahead of this upcoming parliamentary session, we will conclude by welcoming the conference board's focus on clean drinking water. As we did with Senator Prosper last week, we call on the new government to introduce a First Nations Clean Water Act into the new session of Parliament as the first order of business. Inadequate access to housing and sanitation systems have been long-standing issues. Prolonged advisories erode trust and often lead to First Nations seeking unsafe alternatives even after boil water advisories are lifted. It is a shameful situation for a country as rich as our beautiful country, Canada. Alongside clean water legislation, we call on Canada and the provinces to make the investments required to close the First Nations water infrastructure gap. In addition to a $1.79 return on every dollar that's invested, Canada will benefit from increased productivity and reduced rates of illnesses and disease in First Nations communities. We lift up chiefs and tribal council leaders struggling with these unfair infrastructure gaps and for all that they're doing each and every day to help our people in these circumstances. During the recent election, on behalf of chiefs across the country, the Assembly of First Nations published a priorities document titled Prosperity for All. Like the report we are releasing today, Prosperity for All was intended to be a roadmap to reconciliation for the next government. It includes a strong focus on economic reconciliation and closing the First Nations infrastructure gap to drive Canada's collective prosperity for generations to come. These investments were needed before Trump 2.0, and they are even more important now. The truth is that over $560 billion of projects are forecast to be launched on First Nations lands over the next decade. The potential benefit is in the trillions of dollars. Together, they represent a cornerstone of Canada's future economic growth, but they won't advance without First Nations support. If the government's version for First Nations infrastructure is focused exclusively on building access to natural resources on First Nations territories, they have another thing coming. We can't talk about natural resource development and expanding the Port of Churchill, but let's get the basics right first. We can talk about it, but we have to get those basics. So let's start with clean water, quality housing, and modern schools for our kids. We welcome the new government's interest in identifying large-scale infrastructure projects to move ahead with. But that is why, with the new parliament and economic fallout from the U.S. tariffs, we propose that the Prime Minister and his cabinet start with closing the First Nations infrastructure gap in this country. With the commitments in yesterday's speech from the throne related to reconciliation and nation building, the 16 findings in this report are very, very timely. Combined, they provide a blueprint for the mother of all Canadian infrastructure projects. Looking ahead to the next federal budget, we will send copies of this report to the Prime Minister, the Minister of Finance, other new ministers, and members of Parliament from all parties. We look forward to engaging with them in the days ahead to keep this country's journey to reconciliation moving forward in a good way. Later this year, we will commemorate the 10th anniversary of the Historic Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. Yesterday, the King said we needed to honor the truth and reconciliation in both word and deed. What better way for Canada to reaffirm support for reconciliation than making the First Nations infrastructure gap the country's top national infrastructure priority? So let's honor the calls to action. Let's beat Trump and get on with building this beautiful nation. Let's get on with building the high-quality homes that First Nations need. Schools, water system, power supplies, all-season roads, and internet connections for our kids that have been promised to First Nations for generations. So thank you so very much. Miigwech. Hi, Karen.
Hello, National Street. Karen Please, APTN. First question, I mean, one of the things that the new Prime Minister has talked about is speeding up resource approvals, speeding up environmental approvals, and this would definitely help First Nations economies for First Nations who want to develop economies on resource extraction. But looking at the website, there's on free, prior, and informed consent, they're still using the court definition that I guess First Nations can withhold consent, but they still can go ahead. Like, withholding consent doesn't stop development, what's the point? So I'm wondering if, you know, there's been any indication from the Prime Minister that work will be done on defining free, prior, and informed consent, as was promised when they passed the UN DRIP bill.
First of all, I want to uplift the chiefs in Alberta, in BC, in Ontario, and everybody else that's supporting them. Very united. You see First Nations united across the country when our treaty and inherent rights are being trampled on. But I also just want to say that that'll be a point of discussion with my meeting with the Prime Minister in the days ahead. And, you know, we'll be back. We'll come back to you with that. But certainly, absolutely, there's a big question on that we do have to get through with this government. And if they want to do things right, like I said, start with the basics. Make sure that our kids have access to internet, to schools, to homes, to access to food. And poverty shouldn't be administered. And so I know that we have a lot of work to do, but I look forward to meeting with the Prime Minister, and that will be one of the first orders of business.
Will you be asking about free, prior, and informed consent? And then just a second question. With the delay in the federal budget coming out, I'm just wondering about the finances of the Assembly of First Nations itself. I don't know if you've been able to negotiate funding for this fiscal, or if you're riding off of, like, what are, like, has that been delayed at all? Have you got money?
No, the Assembly of First Nations is, you know, we had a surplus again this year. I think that everything's well at the Assembly of First Nations. Things can always be better, like as in every organization, but I think we've got a strong team. I want to commend our new CEO, Andrew Bisson, who's doing a phenomenal job making sure that things are moving slowly. I mean, we always want to make sure that the regions, we've got regional chiefs across this country that we always seem to have problems with every year, that they don't put enough investments into our regional offices. And you know, I'd like to see the federal government help our regional chiefs across the country to make sure that they're well, you know, that they're doing okay. And right now, you know, the AFN is holding them up, but of course we do need support for our regional chiefs and our regional offices.
I'm just not sure. Did the delay in budget cause any delay in negotiate? No, you've been able to negotiate all your funding agreements for this year?
Yeah, we're okay. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Alessia Pesavini with the Canadian Press. Prime Minister Carney promised to work on child welfare reforms. Last week told the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, the Lawyers for Canada, that they shouldn't have to consult indefinitely, or trying to discharge their duty to consult. You had all asked for water legislation to be introduced within 100 days. I asked Indigenous Services if that was the plan, did not get a yes or no answer. Are you seeing a marked shift from the Trudeau era, and what are you doing to advocate for communities' needs when this seems to be a different environment?
Well, first of all, I want to thank the throne speech yesterday. I think it was a chapter changing when we had free, prior, and informed consent for the first time in the history of this country, have that mentioned in a throne speech. And there was a lot of reference to Indigenous people in there. I want to take that as a positive and give them the benefit of the doubt. I know sometimes I've been through transition. I know sometimes during transition periods things have been chaotic, and they have been. I mean, I went to the, you know, I've done a few things with them right before the election that was really difficult without a government there. So I'm glad that they're there, and I hope that they come together quickly, and there's always room for improvement. And we'll be there to tell them and remind them when they're shorting First Nations in any way. Is there a change? I'm sure there's obviously going to be a change, I think, from one government to the next. But I think, you know, I've spent some time with Prime Minister Carney last weekend, all weekend, a long weekend. And, you know, we had deep discussions on many of these issues, and we do want to make sure that water legislation is, and that those discussions on water, that we begin to work on those very quickly. I also want to make sure, you know, if there's something as a mother and a woman every time that we have babies, and no other group in the world is legislated the way First Nations are. We're the only group around the entire world that is legislated. And every time I have a baby that the government wants to know if my child's eligible to be First Nation. And I think that that's something that we have. There are uncomfortable conversations that need to be had. But the second generation, the government keeps losing in court because they keep discriminating against us. We have a baby and they ask, who's the father? Very intrusive, right? Is your baby First Nation? Very intrusive. And I think that's another discussion that I want to have as a mom and as because you're seeing it, right? They come at First Nations so hard. And I think that we have to have that uncomfortable conversation with Prime Minister Carney. Of course, there's policing, and you're right, the unfinished business of child welfare. So lots of work to do.
On the Chiefs were in town this week, disappointed that they weren't invited to the throne speech and didn't get an audience with the King. But beyond that, like, the Globe and Mail reported this morning that Ottawa gave the First Nations Council 7 days to meet with them or submit their thoughts on proposed legislation around projects identified to be in the national interest. Chiefs are bringing up I Don't Know More in Ontario. Does this concern you?
Well, I'm proud of them. I mean, you have the provincial government trampling all over treaty and inherent rights across this country, from Alberta to Ontario to BC. Many other chiefs are standing up saying, how can we help? I don't blame them. They're frustrated and they're being disrespected. And if this wouldn't happen, if the way that this country operates, you know, the provinces go and talk, they take the Prime Minister and they go and talk. It's happening again next week. They always leave out First Nations people. They always leave out Indigenous people and Indigenous voices. And so, like I said, if you know, we want to move forward too in this country. First Nations want to move forward. But you can't do that without having those voices at the table and thinking we know what's best. That hasn't worked for 150 years. It's not going to work for the next 150 years. So let's get down to business. Let's ask this country, are you really ready? And are you really ready to make space at your table to make sure that the rights holders are at that table? Yeah.
To Karen's initial question though, on consultation, First Nations are, again, they're talking about I don't know more, they're talking about going to court. Are you in support of these concerns that they're being raised here, that they're willing to go that far if their rights aren't respected, and from the outside, it looks like they might not be?
We've been to court. First Nations keep winning in court, on the provinces, on the feds, and if they're, I want a Canada where are we done being in court? Can we go into a room and negotiate and talk to each other in a good way? Otherwise we do, our last resort is always court. Unfortunately, that's what's brought change on child welfare, for instance, on even, Quebec challenging us with First Nations kids that the provinces, own our children. Our people stood up and had to fight them back in court on tobacco trade, even on policing, that they've underfunded, and that whole case, right, on policing, we keep winning in court. So we don't want to be at court, but at the same time, if we're not at the table making these decisions right off the bat, this is what happens, and it causes the Canadian government more problems later. So why not just make space for First Nations? Every other national chief before me has had to deal with this, and I feel for them. And I don't think the next national chief after me should have to deal with that.
We will now take questions on Zoom. As usual, one question, one follow-up. Palak, please go ahead.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Good morning.
Hi. I heard a reference to infrastructure projects being building off the top. I'm sure you saw the Prime Minister saying yesterday that he wants to name specific projects coming out of next week's meeting with premiers. But he did also admit that there is going to be competition between these projects. So from the AFN's perspective, what are your thoughts on this? How should that competition be addressed? And are there specific projects that you want to see prioritized?
First of all, the AFN, we walk a fine line. We don't want to step on rights holders, number one, right? We want to make sure that rights holders are front and center on this. We can't use the AFN to just sideswipe First Nations, although we are here as a vehicle to help bridge and bring people together. Second of all, I think also making on the government's loose standards of procurement, that has to be fixed immediately. And we've given you the tools in the toolbox to do that, to make sure that there's that companies and these groups of people that are using procurement for themselves and not being connected to First Nations communities and to our people, that is wrong. Fix procurement tomorrow morning. We're here. We're ready to work with you on that. Thirdly, I think, when you're going to, first of all, and I think I'll be talking to the Prime Minister about this again in the days ahead, something that him and I have to discuss, but also making sure that when you make these big announcements that the majority of those investments get to First Nations. I was talking to the Auditor General this morning about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. All that funding went out. It went to Indigenous organizations. It didn't hit First Nations women who need it the most. And, people always take advantage of that. And this is the problem that we have in our country. And I think also, you have all this in the numbers. I know that the Inuit, they're 6 to 1,000. First Nations are 1.5 million people. We're huge in this country. And I think that the country has to prioritize. If we really want to make an impact, let's focus on making sure that the majority of that, if we're going to work on populations on that the majority of that, those investments get to First Nations people.
And as a follow-up, I heard you mention the former water bill that is now dead, that died on the order paper, sorry. I remember a couple of weeks ago you had said, if it doesn't get introduced within the first 100 days of the new session, it probably won't happen. So I know you said that you spoke to Mr. Carney, I guess it would have been two weekends ago now, but what kind of outreach have you done to the new minister? I'm assuming here that it's going to be her tabling it, and what has been the reception on her part?
I've told all parties about because they're all responsible for it dying on the order paper. People played politics with the water bill, and shame on every member of parliament. And it's not to be mean to people, but I'm going to just say it. You had a responsibility to do the right thing instead of play politics, especially when you think of those little First Nation kids out there. We should be focused on them as a member of parliament, and we have a new parliament now. Every single member of parliament has a duty to First Nations children, whether you're, you all represent First Nations in your, I don't know, one area that doesn't have a First Nation in it. You're all responsible for those little children. Think of that. If your kids are not having access to clean drinking water, and when you're playing with their lives like that with politics, shame on everyone. And so get it moving and get it going, and let's be realistic, and let's work through some of the things that we like and don't like out of that bill. We were hoping that it would get to Senator Prosper to help us through with the Senate and many of the other senators to help fix some of those issues. We couldn't even get there because people were playing politics with the lives of First Nations children and their access to clean drinking water. And so shame on all of us.
Last question is from Fraser Needham. Please go ahead.
Good morning. I just wanted to take you back to a bit for the royal visit. I know that it wasn't in the original schedule, but late in the day, yourself and the presidents of MNC and ITK did have short meetings with King Charles. Can you tell me what happened there, or what led to that?
Absolutely. I want to thank him. I know that we had met one-on-one for about half an hour, and it was a good discussion, and it was a discussion of our ancestors. I know that his great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, and my great-great-great-grandfather, my ancestor, Chief Richard Woodhouse, signed Treaty 2 in 1871, August 21st. And we talked about the treaty medal that I was wearing, and I told him he should update it with, and we talk about that because we talk about how Canada was created, that it was created with First Nations people through treaty and through peace and friendship. We never had wars. We created this beautiful country together, and we talked about that. And we also talked about sustainable development in the world, how destructive humankind is. We talked about treaty rights, about them not being respected, and about the Indian Act. We'd signed treaties in 1871, but yet about a decade later, Parliament comes down with the Indian Act that has been very hurtful to First Nations people, like I said, to legislate us. We're the only people around the world to be legislated. And to talk to him about that and to talk about other initiatives, we talked about a lot of things in the half hour that we were together, but certainly about the history of this country, how this country was created, and that, we talked about the colonialism at the from the U.S. that are coming down. We don't need more colonialism in this country. And lastly, we talked about reconciliation and how far that has come and how far we need to go, because we've done some really good things as a country. I'm proud of everybody in this beautiful country that are trying, but at the same time, we have a long way to go. And I feel like sometimes it stalls and sometimes things advance, but we have to keep trying. So I also want to thank the press for helping on these issues day to day. So thank you so much for having me today. Miigwech?
Oh, do I get a follow-up or?
Yeah, you can have a follow-up.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, so I'm just back to, I was just wondering though, because it wasn't anywhere in the initial schedule, and then an email came out very late in the day, about 4:30, that the three of you would be meeting. So I'm just wondering, did you bring this up with the like the Prime Minister's staff or with the Heritage Minister, that this was a problem, that you didn't have a scheduled meeting, or that, because at the same time there's a lot of First Nations here that were on the Hill, very disappointed that they weren't able to get a meeting with the King, and it traveled a long way. So was there, did you talk to some of those officials and ask if they could schedule some time in, or what happened there?
Well, of course. I'll always advocate to make space for First Nations, and I've been doing that for the past months. Once we got the notice that he was coming here, to start pushing for space for First Nations. I know that they had so I know they've done some things. I'm glad that the Algonquin children drummed him in when he landed here. And I'm glad for the elders that were there from the Kitiganzi B community. I'm thankful that they were there. I'm glad for the Algonquins of Pikwaktagon, Chief Greg Sarazan, who was also there. And I'm thankful that they'd welcomed him to their territory. I'm also thankful that that the Majesties agreed to meet with me. I did send them a letter to request that, but I also, of course I wanted space for all First Nations. We all deserve to have our voices heard. And, I know that when they went to Lansdowne Park, that they brought in, Piganjigum First Nation, for instance, they brought in one of their sustainable development projects that they're working on. I'm very proud of them. And, when they were in the Senate yesterday, we had about 20 plus chiefs in there. And we had, of course, like strong treaty people like Regina Crowchild and, Leonard Weasel Traveler. And who else was in there? There was just different, Chief Derek Nepanak and Grand Chief Wilson and Chief Roy Whitney. There was lots of different people that attended that, and it was so nice to see former National Chief Perry Bellegarde and his wife Valerie were in the crowd. Chief Lewis, who's from Onion Lake, he was there, very strong treaty people. So there's lots of strong treaty people in the crowd. I think we had a number. And I know that we needed more seats, and I think next time the Governor General, of course, has to make sure that there's space for First Nations anytime the Royals come to Canada. I get it. It was a tight, short notice. It was in a time when we're in transition with government, but regardless, you have to make sure, because of our unique relationship with their Majesties and with the royal family, to make sure that First Nations are front and center, because they have treaties, and that's the way that this country was created, was through our ancestors. So I think we could do a better job next time. We have to do a better job. So thank you.
Can I just ask a quick
Yeah.
question? You talked about the provincial territorial meetings and federal provincial territorial meetings, and then you said you also made the comment we need to be at the table. But I just want to clarify: have you asked Prime Minister Mark Carney to include First Nations leadership in those meetings?
I'm going to officially do that. I am meeting him this week, and I've always said it publicly. We will be, we've written letters before. Former national chiefs have written letters before on how Confederation conducts themselves. I know they're uncomfortable all the time. It's kind of like keep them there and keep them happy, but I think gone are those days. And it's particularly when we don't need more colonialism in Canada. We already have enough at our borders right now. And I think Canadians, when you feel that, we felt that for a very long time. First Nations have felt colonialism for a very, very long time. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. This concludes the press conference. Merci. C'est ce qui conclut cette conférence de presse.